Um, well, welcome to the final session of this wonderful meeting. I'm Bernard Carr. I'm had the honour of being the president of the Scientific and Medical Network. I was only appointed to that position rather recently, and I should point out that my predecessor was Peter Fenwick, who, of course, we heard from earlier today, and he served in that position for 20 years, and he's now the emeritus president. It is a huge honour to take on the role of being president, but it's even more a privilege, I think, to be president of the SM at this exciting time, because I think this project, which we've been talking about today and yesterday, the post-material science project and the sort of Galileo Commission, I think it's one of the most exciting endeavors the Scientific Medical Network, indeed all of us, have been involved in for such a long time. And I feel it's a tremendous privilege to be, taking on the president's role at this time. Anyway, my function now is to chair this last session, which is on physics, non-locality and synchronicity. I should say that I am a physicist, and I'm passionate about trying to extend physics so that it can accommodate so-called paranormal and mystical phenomena. And that's why I feel this session is really important. And I say that because I actually think that this area will only become regarded as scientifically respectable if it does make some link with physics. This is because what's fascinating to me about some of these phenomena is that they do involve a direct interaction between consciousness and the physical world. And so if these phenomena are real, it does have to involve some extension of physics. Having said that, I also have to point out that not everyone is very happy about making that extension. Most physicists aren't happy with making such an extension because they don't believe in the phenomena, by and large. And furthermore, even many of the people involved in parapsychology or mystical experiences aren't particularly interested in making the link with physics because they see it as being too reductionists. And so I do want to stress that when we talk about post-materialist science, you might think that this is eliminating a sort of physicalistic approach from the beginning, and that's something which I think is wrong. There's a distinction between a materialistic view of the world and some extension of physics. But of course, one also sometimes talks about getting beyond physicalism. There's the famous volume, Beyond Physicalism, by Ed Kelly et al., which might suggest that we're dealing with something which cannot be accommodated by physics, and that is again something I want to argue against. It's a matter of semantics, because one is talking about an extended physics, not what would normally be called physicalism. But having said that, that just reflects my own bias as a physicist. The scope of topics this afternoon is slightly broader than that, because we go on to talk about non-locality and synchronicity. And so one isn't exclusively talking about physics, but one is talking about the interaction with physics. And it seems to me the session we're going to have is rather like the famous meeting between Pauli and Jung, the great physicist and the great psychiatrist, who were sort of trying to bring a link between the physics and the psychic. Mm-hmm. And in some sense, that's what's going to happen with our session this afternoon. So anyway, that's enough of me, and I will now, it's my great pleasure to introduce the three contributors. And I should say that the three contributors are, two of them are playing a very important role in this book, because they are actually editors of the book. Gary Schwartz and Stefan Schwartz are editors of the book, Is Consciousness Primary? And Ed Close is also, I believe, a contributor to the book. He certainly is a contributor to the first book. So they've all been very much involved in this project, and I'm going to introduce them one by one. The first contribution is going to come from Ed Close, and he will be talking about physics. Ed has been he's been interested in the interaction between consciousness and quantum reality for at least 40 years, and so he's uniquely prepared in the sense of being involved in the post-materialist science movement because of the necessary emphasis on physics. But I have to say, I also feel very close to Ed, although we've never actually met, because he has been with his colleague Vernon Nepi. He has been an advocate of the high dimensional approach. And as some of you may know, this is also my hobby horse. I believe the high dimensional approach is the way to go. And it's not something that most physicists agree with me about, and it's not something even that most parapsychologists agree with me about. But I was delighted, incidentally, when I heard Julia Mossbridge yesterday expressing support for this idea as well. So Ed, I'm particularly pleased to ask you. I don't know what you're going to say about this, but I'm hoping you're going to mention that. And I should also say that I think Ed and Vernon indeed got a prestigious award, the Whiting Memorial Prize, for their work on this project. So anyway, without any further ado, Ed, I would like to invite you to give your short presentation.
Thank you, Bernard. I appreciate the wonderful introduction, and I'd like to thank you and to thank David and Andrew for this opportunity to be able to speak to so many people, because I've been talking about this subject for a long time. And of course, being invited to be part of the AAPS was an honor and a great opportunity for me. And the book is Consciousness Primary. Came about when about a dozen of us were invited to Arizona by doctors Gary Schwartz and Marjorie Wollicott to give our answer to that question and explain why we answered it the way we did. And that was the generation of the book, is Consciousness Primary. In my case, I was talking about, as you've mentioned, application of mathematics, and particularly hyperdimensional mathematics. But I want to start by looking at the question, is consciousness primary? If we look at this closely, it has deeper questions embedded within it. For instance, what is consciousness? There are many scientists who will tell you that we have no idea what consciousness is, even though it's the only thing we experience directly. And then there's the question, can science, and you touched upon it, is science able to answer such a question? And I would go to the philosopher of science, Karl Popper, who said, a question can only be answered by science if it can be stated as a hypothesis that can be falsified. So we start there, and we can then restate the question as the statement, consciousness is primary, as a hypothesis, which could be, according to Russell and Whited in their theory of types, there were, according to them, only three possibilities that can either be true, false, or meaningless. However, a British logician named G. Spencer Brown came along and wrote a book that was wonderful inspiration to me in the 60s, called Laws of Form. And in Laws of Form, he said, no, there are actually four types. There's true, false, paradoxical, and meaningless. Now, what did he mean by paradoxical? He said and this I think should put his name in the Mathematics Hall of Fame, if nothing else did. He said it's analogous to complex numbers in pure math. And that, of course, brings to mind a quote of Niels Bohr, the man who is one of the fathers of quantum physics, when he said, "Oh, we have a paradox. Great. Now we can make some progress." So paradoxes are meaningful. And then we have, to put this in a mathematical context, and I'll explain why I'm doing this. We have Kurt Gödel, who is a Hungarian mathematician, who proved a set of theorems called the incompleteness theorems, which in effect say that in any consistent logical system, there will always be questions that cannot be answered within that system. And I think most scientists will agree that reality is a consistent logical system. If it were not, then science would not be possible. So on this basis, my chapter was rather immodestly titled "The Mathematical Unification of Space-Time, Matter, Energy, and Consciousness." And in this chapter, I tried to introduce a new quantum calculus, which I call the calculus of dimensional distinctions. And the types of statements then that I was talking about earlier become distinctions, non-distinctions, extra-dimensional distinctions, or meaningless distinctions. So those are four, similar to what G. Spencer Brown talked about, except I'm including consciousness. Now, my chapter was a little part of a book called Reality Begins with Consciousness. It's like a 400 plus page book by Dr. Bernanke and myself. And it was an introduction to what we call the triadic dimensional vortical paradigm, or TDVP for short. Now, I think that's enough to demonstrate that the question, is consciousness primary, is not a trivial one. But on the other hand, I actually agree with what one of our presenters said yesterday when Manas Kathatas said, reality is really very simple. And I agree with that. But then you look at the little book by Einstein entitled Relativity, the General and Special Theories, an explanation that anyone can understand, then that kind of puts it into context. It's a complex subject, but if it's broken down, anyone can understand it. Now, many mainstream scientists refuse to even try to answer such questions, and their excuse is that it's not their specialty, because in mainstream science, there's a lot of specialization, even within physics or within mathematics. And that prevents them from being able to really address what we call a theory of everything. But then there are many of the mainstream scientists who will answer that question, is consciousness primary, with a resounding no, because they believe that consciousness is an epiphenomenon of physical evolution. And that's the basis of the belief in materialism or physicalism, which is, as you mentioned, the dominant metaphysical basis in mainstream science today. Yet here we have in this group, in this conference, yesterday and today, a group of successful scientists who have braved the very real condemnation and censorship that the dominant mainstream science community has, to explain why, after years of research, they have concluded that consciousness is either a fundamental or a primary aspect of reality. So the AAPS book is Consciousness Primary, and each of us has revealed our answer, and each of us explains how we arrived at that answer. So I'm going to try to give you briefly my story now. When I began my academic career as a physics major, math minor, 65 years ago, 1955, psychology was considered to be a pseudoscience, and J.B. Rhine was just beginning to try to raise parapsychology to the level of a science in Duke University. And there was very little academic interest here in the United States in exploring the interface between mind and matter. I seemed to be, in my world at that time, one of the only among my peers in physics and mathematics with such an interest. In 1958, I was part of a very successful paralogical experiment that was sent to Dr. Rhine, and he was impressed with our results, but he advised me to go ahead and get my degree in physics and math because that would guarantee me a job and an income, because there was not much demand for parapsychologists. So why was I so interested in this weird new field considered by most of my colleagues to be pseudoscience? Well, as a child, I had experiences that seemed so natural and real and normal to me that I thought everyone had such experiences. By the age of 10 or 11, I'd had 2 near-death experiences and a number of out-of-body experiences. In some of the OBEs, I saw things that I later verified. I also have vivid memories all the way back to my birth and before. I had memories that I was quite sure came from a previous lives and even between lives. I wrote about a few of these memories and experiences in my chapter of the AAPS volume, and I've written about more of them in my first book, the Book of Atma, which was published in 1977, and my last book, Secrets of the Sacred Cube, a cosmic love story, which was published in 2019, and in several other books and articles. So the point is that I know from experience that consciousness can and does exist outside the boundaries of the physical body. That makes me a little different type of physicist, I think. I discovered Einstein's special theory of relativity when I was about 14 years old, and I decided to become a theoretical physicist. By the early 1960s, when I was teaching, I had become convinced of 2 things. One, there had to be a way to include consciousness in the equations of natural science, and 2, the multidimensional approach to mathematical modeling of reality, initiated, by the way, by Einstein and Minkowski, and extended by Kaluza, Klein, Pauli, and a few others, was the way to go. So their efforts, however, were overshadowed in the 30s and 40s and 50s and on by search for practical applications of relativity and quantum physics, quantum mechanics, and the progress toward a hyperdimensional theory of everything was smothered in mainstream science. My mathematical background made it possible for me to get good work, as J.B. Ryan suggested it would. And while working as an actuarial mathematics technician in downtown Los Angeles in 1960, one night I received initiation into the time-honored consciousness expansion techniques taught by Paramahansa Yogananda, known as Kriya Yoga. I have practiced Kriya Yoga daily from that point on, so more than 60 years. In 1969, I was one of the charter members of the U.S. Government Systems Analysis Group, where we produced detailed mathematical models of environmental systems. I worked for the Department of Interior in this capacity for 12 years, while still practicing Kriya Yoga and doing independent research in consciousness, really, on the side. During the 3 decades, 1970 to 2000, I discovered that most mainstream scientists, with the possible exception of Wolfgang Pauli, did not really understand the deep insights of Einstein and Planck. It was clear to me that the next major paradigm shift would be the shift from scientific materialism to a multidimensional consciousness-based theory of everything. And like every major paradigm shift before, it would require new mathematics. Paradigm shifts always do. The new math had to be capable of handling the inclusion of consciousness as a variable. In 1986, I started working on a new mathematical system, which I called the calculus of distinctions. In 2008, I took a test and qualified for and joined the International Society for Philosophical Inquiry. I'm not usually a joiner, but I joined for a purpose. This was a high integrity, high IQ society where I met Dr. Vernon Neppy, who had the same dream that I did. We joined forces, and with Vernon's help, I discovered how consciousness fits into the equations of physics as a non-physical component of reality that organizes up quarks, down quarks, and electrons into stable atoms and molecules and life-supporting structures. We call that component Gimel, for want of a better thing. There are several reasons we called it that, but I won't go into that. We published a number of papers, and in 2011, we published Reality Begins with Consciousness, a basic discussion of our TDVP model. Now, my chapter in the AAPS volume includes the mathematical derivation from basic physics principles and meticulous Large Hadron Collider data leading to the discovery of Gimel. It also answers the question, is consciousness primary, with a strong affirmative. Consciousness in its most primitive form is a multidimensional substrate of reality. And that's just the beginning of the new paradigm. You can find out more about this on my blog, which is my Transcendental Physics blog, named after a book that I wrote in 1990s, erclosetphysics.com, and there are over 500 blog posts there, and also on brainvoyage.com, which is Vernon's site. And I'll stop there because I'm sure I've used up. There's so many things we could talk about here.
Ed, thank you very much. I'm afraid, yes, it is best if you stop at this point, so the other speakers have their slots. Thank you so much for introducing this discussion. I think one point that your talk emphasized was that the fact that you have had experiences, and that is what triggered your interest in this, in the subject. And I find that seems to be true of whatever discipline people come from, whether it's physics or parapsych or psychology or neuroscience, it's the having of the experience which triggers the interest, if you like, in post-materialist science. And very often the people who are, after all, the majority who don't take the subject seriously are simply the people who haven't had the experience. So thank you for telling us about the experience as well as the theoretical aspect of what you said. I was also particularly pleased that you mentioned Spencer Brown, because when I started my research in this area, he was a well-known name, but he sort of faded now, but had a very big effect in psychical research, and I was really pleased that you introduced his name. But so thank you for that, Ed. Now I'm now delighted to move on to the second contribution, which will come from Stefan Schwartz, and he is going to tell us about non-locality. I mean, Stefan, I think, has really spent his life studying the nature of consciousness at both an individual and a social level. He covers a huge range of topics. He's an experimentalist, a historian, a futurist, and he's an award-winning author. But also, if I'm not mistaken, he is the person who actually first advocated the idea of non-locality. I mean, I may be wrong in that, but he can correct me if I am wrong. So he's the best person to talk on this. He's written a huge number of books, important books, both actually including novels, but I don't have time to go through those books now. All I would say is that, of course, he is one of the editors of Is Consciousness Primary? And my understanding is that he has played a crucial role in actually the in the pushing of both these books. So thank you very much indeed for that, Stefan. But Stefan, I'd now like to ask you to give your short presentation on non-locality.
Well, let me start by saying that the idea that consciousness is fundamental is not at all a new idea. It was, in fact, it has been, in fact, a central belief of most of the cultures of the world for most of history. Materialism arose because of the Council of Trent between 1545 and 1563, in 25 meetings in Bologna and Trento. The Roman Catholic Curia had a series of meetings because they felt threatened by both the Reformation and by the beginning development of science in its modern form. And they issued a edict that said basically that anything that had to do with consciousness was the realm of the church. They called it spirit, but what they meant was consciousness. And that you guys in science can have everything that has to do with the physical. And further, if you go over to our realm and we can get a hold of you, we're going to torture you and kill you and burn you alive. And that's exactly what happened. And so materialism became that's really the impulse that created materialism. And over the next several hundred years, because the church was the dominant cultural force, whenever they could get hold of somebody, that's exactly what they did. And it's only until the 19th century when, in a synchronous series of developments, that psychology, psychiatry, anthropology, and parapsychology all began within a period of about 50 years, because a small but potent group of scientists simply had confronted the idea of consciousness as fundamental and couldn't avoid it, and began to really investigate it in a serious way. I personally am a Planckian. In October 25th, 1931, Max Planck was interviewed by the Observer newspaper in London, and he didn't give a lot of interviews, and so it's very important, this interview. And they said to him, you know, what do you and Einstein are the two most famous scientists in history. What have you learned? And Planck's answer was, I think, not at all what the reporter expected. He said, what I've learned is that consciousness is primary and fundamental. You can't get behind consciousness. Space-time arises from consciousness, not consciousness from space-time. And so that really began, that the end of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, really begins the study of the reintegration of consciousness with science. And there are now at least six protocols that have results of better than 1 in a billion that they would be happening by chance. To give you a sense of the importance of that, 1 in 20 is considered significant, and this is 1 in a billion. To give you another sense, when things get to just a fraction of that, they become accepted ideas in science. The other thing that I think is important is that almost all of religions begin with the premise that consciousness is fundamental and primary. If you look at all the major religions of the world, what you see is that they begin when one person has a non-local consciousness experience. At the age of 30, John baptizes Jesus. He goes into the desert and meditates and awakens. Muhammad, at the age of 40, goes to the sacred cave of Hira, meditates and has a non-local consciousness experience. And the Buddha goes to an ashram, learns to meditate, has a conscious and non-local consciousness experience. The Patanjali in the 2nd century learns to meditate and ultimately writes the Yoga Sutras that begin the foundation of yoga. So over and over, if you look at religions, what you see is that they all start with an individual who has a non-local consciousness experience. So let me say very quickly a little bit about what we know about non-local consciousness. We don't know what consciousness is. At least I don't know anybody that knows what consciousness is. And we don't know what information is, but I think what we are looking at, and I think the evidence is pretty compelling about this. I won't have much time to get into this, but I've certainly written about it in many places. You can go to academia.edu and get my papers or get my books, and I've written about it at great length. But basically, what we seem to be looking at is that physical reality is a manipulation of intentioned consciousness. Now, we know this in all sorts of ways. For instance, Gary, who's going to speak after me, did an experiment in which he had real Hebrew words and fake Hebrew words, and people found it easier to remember the real words than the fake words. And even the words that were older were easier than the words that were younger. And a series of other experiments have looked at not only the things like that, but also the shape of the words. And there was even an experiment in Morse code in which they had real Morse code and fake Morse code, and people were able to remember the real Morse code better than the fake Morse code. And so the shape of the letters, the way scriptures are actually written, what all of this seems to be telling us is that culture is a creation of acts of common intention consciousness. That's why the Japanese and the Italians cook eggplants in very different ways, because culture is a manifestation of collective intention. Now, we know that there are certain things that we can do to manipulate the ability to access non-local consciousness. The most important one seems to be based, again, I'm a data person, so all I care about is experimental data. And it's very clear that the most important thing that gives you the ability to open to this aspect of yourself, and it's something that everybody has, is meditation. And that's why meditation is taught in Tibetan monasteries and Christian seminaries and martial art dojos. The ability to attain and sustain intention-focused awareness seems to be the critical component of making contact with this non-local aspect of consciousness. And this non-local aspect of consciousness directly addresses a central issue, and that is the continuity of consciousness. What it's saying is that consciousness exists prior to incarnation, during incarnation, and continues after incarnation, after physical death. We know that, for instance, from the 2,500 or more cases that of reincarnation that were studied by have been studied over 2 generations at the University of Virginia, that what comes across in incarnations is information. There's a wonderful book called Biology and Reincarnation written by Ian Stevenson, in which he shows that birthmarks and wound tissue, scar tissue, comes across based on experiences in prior lives. So what we're dealing with, I think, and to me, the most interesting part of physics right now is information theory physics, is that information is manipulated in some way that we don't understand very clearly, but we do know that we can improve the ability to access it by, first of all, meditation, and then second of all, by manipulating what Jung called numinosity. Jung says noumena are psychic entia. They exist outside of space-time. I think what he means by noumena is information. And that we know, for instance, that it is easier in remote viewing for a person to remote view successfully Chartres Cathedral than it is a French warehouse of the same size. Why? Because from the moment it was conceived of, Chartres Cathedral has been the focus of intentioned awareness with an emotional, highly emotional component, whereas nobody pays any attention to a French warehouse. Similarly, we also know from the experimental data that entropic process, when it is present, makes it easier for people to acquire non-local information. That's why whether it is a nuclear carrier and is easier to see than a diesel-powered carrier. That's why death is an entropic process, because it is informationally entropic. We know from all the experimental evidence that we have that acts of intentioned awareness, particularly when they are reiterated, change literally the structure of reality. Roger Nelson's Global Consciousness Project has been addressing that issue for a number of years. But we also know, as I said, that there's a number of experiments which show that, like Gary's Hebrew word experiment, that acts of intentioned awareness reiterated across a long period of time make it easier to access information. Daryl Bem, a psychologist at Cornell University, has shown that emotion plays an enormous role in this. Other experiments show that it's easier to see an image which has a emotionally evocative violence or sexuality, emotionally evocative aspect than one that does not. We can see that the nature of how we focus our intention plays a social role. Culture, as I said, is the result of collective expression of intention. And when you want to cause fundamental change in a society, the reason nonviolence is more effective than violent change only succeeds 25% of the time. Nonviolent change succeeds 75% of the time, and nonviolent change lasts longer. is because nonviolent change is inclusive and incorporates collective consciousness, where violent change is exclusive and creates a them and an us. And so I would suggest that the way that we as a people are going to get through climate change, which is going to be the largest catastrophe that humanity has ever faced, a civilization existential catastrophe, is by recognizing we do not have dominion over the earth. We are simply a part of a great matrix of consciousness. I just read a paper yesterday in Frontiers of Physics showing that the human brain and the universe are remarkably similar in their construction. I just have not fully digested this paper because I just read it yesterday afternoon. But the point I'm trying to make is that we live in a world that is modulated by consciousness. And if we are going to go forward in a successful future, we are going to need to recognize that consciousness is fundamental and causal and must be incorporated into the structure of our research and our social policies.
Okay, thank you, Stefan. Stefan, you were sort of mainly focusing on the sociological aspects of non-local consciousness. One of the issues I hope we'll get into later in the dialogue or the trialogue is the issue of how the non-locality you're talking about relates to the non-locality which arises in quantum mechanics, because obviously in quantum mechanics there's a lot of reference to non-locality as well. So I don't want to initiate that discussion now, but just to give advance notice that I think that will be an important thing to discuss. And I was also fascinated the way you described that really it all began in the 70s, I think you said, when from a variety of different areas the initiative came to link consciousness with science. But I think what's interesting is that still in the 1970s, consciousness was still a taboo word.
Yes.
And what's remarkable now is 50 years later, it isn't taboo. I mean, people may not believe in parapsychology, but people can talk about cosmology, both from a point of view of physics and neuroscience and of course psychology and philosophy. So it seems to me that just as the 70s was the first important phase transition, if you like, it seems to me now perhaps we're approaching another phase transition.
Yes, I think that's correct.
And I won't ask you to elaborate on that now, but again, that's something which perhaps we can talk about later. So thank you very much indeed for that, Stefan. Well, our third panelist is Gary Schwartz. I've actually known Gary for many years. On background, he's a professor of psychology, medicine, neurology, psychiatry, and surgery at the University of Arizona. And he's also the director of his Laboratory for Advances in Consciousness and Health. So he comes from a very broad background, but maybe the thing I should most emphasize that he was actually the founding president of the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Science. So obviously now that role has been taken on by Marjorie, but obviously that was a very important role for starting it all off. Now he's written many books, and I'm not going to try and review all the books. I will just say that his most recent book was called Super Synchronicity, which clearly, I should also say, of course, he is an editor of I think both the books, Consciousness is Primary, and the second volume as well. But I mentioned his most recent book, Super Synchronicity, because I think he's going to address the topic of synchronicity in his presentation. So, Gary, over to you.
Bernard, thanks. You know, it's a privilege to be part of this and to be part of a panel where three of my heroes, I was preceded by three of my heroes, one of which happens to be a Schwartz, which I think is very amusing. And in order for me to stay within a time limit, I'm going to read most of this, but some of it will be spontaneous. and then we'll have time for, obviously conversation later. First of all, I'd like to thank David and Marjorie, all the panel chairs and speakers, and all the collaborators in AAPS, the Scientific Medical Network, the Galileo Commission, and IONS, who helped make this seminal international virtual meeting on the primacy of consciousness in post-material sciences possible. You may be wondering, why did we decide to include a chapter on synchronicity in this book? The reason was unanticipated. I had already written my planned chapter for the book, which is titled, How Do Scientists Change Their Minds? The Example of Survival of Consciousness. However, the last chapter of the book was originally planned to be focused on the relationship between the primacy of consciousness and spirituality, to be written by Professor Lisa Miller. Sadly, Lisa was in a car accident and had to withdraw. And at the 11th hour, I agreed to write a chapter addressing a controversial aspect of spirituality in post-material sciences titled Supersynchronicity and the Primacy of Consciousness, Bridging Science, Metaphysics, and Spirituality. Now, a bit of context is helpful here about my background. I was raised in an essentially atheistic home. Like Charlie and Dean, I had early training in electrical engineering. Like Marjorie, my formal education was based in mainstream materialist science, and in my case, in psychophysiology and clinical health psychology. Marjorie shared with us her two parallel lives, one as a neuroscientist, the other as a meditation experiencer. And listening to Marjorie, I was reminded that I developed two parallel lives, one as a psychophysiologist, the other as a synchronicity experiencer and analyzer, which, by the way, I kept secret for years. My synchronicity journey began when I was a professor at Yale and blossomed when I moved to the University of Arizona. And like Julia, instead of science taking me away from spirituality, science actually led me to spirituality. Using Julia's term, science became a spiritual path for me, an evidence-based spiritual path. In fact, I came to appreciate how the scientific method could be applied to the laboratories of our personal lives, what I think of as self-science. In a deep sense, as a result of my self-science journey, documenting complex serial coincidences, I was personally evolving into an evidence-based scientist mystic. Diane expressed it, the phenomena, quote, rocked my reality, unquote. And one does not have to be a gifted psychic, healer, or mystic to experience synchronicity. One just has to learn how to look at it. What's interesting, especially when Bernard was relating, Pauli and Jung and how we're ending this particular panel and conference with comments about synchronicity, is that Carl Jung said, he put it this way, synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see. In my journey, I came to realize that we could categorize serial coincidences or synchronicities into three types. What I call type 1, which is a single pair, a type 2, where 3 to 5 events occur in a row, and type 3, 6 or 4 meaningful events in a row. Now, type 3 synchronicities, and 6 or more, we can call them supersynchronicities, like superclusters of galaxies, or superconductivity, or supercomputers. And in 2017, I published a book titled Supersynchronicity, Where Science and Spirit Meet. Now, the best way to get a feeling for this is to share a personal example of a set of serial synchronicities. I'll go through them very quickly so that you can get a feeling for the oddity of all of this and the ridiculous improbability. And I will illustrate astronomical improbability. So I'm going to describe the first 10 of 18 duck synchronicities in a 6-day period. And as I go through them, I want you to, in each case, ask, did you have this experience? Have you ever had this kind of experience involving a duck? And what do you think the probability of having such experience is? Here we go. Number 1. On Sunday morning, I received an email from a colleague. It's actually an evolutionary psychology blog, if you would. And it was about a 4-legged duck, cute little duck lying on its back with 4 legs. No, I've never seen a four-legged duck. I suspect many people haven't. It caught my attention. And by the way, synchronicities often the first one catches your attention, but it's not a synchronicity because you don't know it's a synchronicity yet. But anyway, the four-legged duck occurred. I said, gee, that's cute. Didn't think anything about it. But then that night, Sunday evening, this is number 2, I was having a meeting with a gentleman and his wife, with my wife Rhonda and myself at a restaurant, and we were coming to know each other. He was interested in possibly funding an energy medicine institute at the time, energy systems, human energy systems laboratory, and we somehow got at the discussion of names and family history, and I shared that Schwartz means black in German. And I asked him if his last name had any meaning, and he said no. He said, but he does have a family crest, which is unusual because his family crest features ducks. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't typically hear about people's family crests, and I had never heard about one with a duck. And I immediately thought about the four-legged duck, because it was clearly in my consciousness. And I said, gee, that's a type 1 synchronicity. What an odd combination. Had no meaning to me whatsoever, but it now triggered my thoughts. The next morning, I was reading the latest Robert Parker book. He's now deceased, wrote about a character called Spencer, a detective. And I read a few pages a day. It's a passion. And anyway, in the second page of the book, the author writes about Spencer saying that we need to get our ducks in a row. Now, I had read more than 30 Parker books by that time, and I knew that ducks in a row is not a common phrase to be found in these kinds of books. In fact, I went back and checked it later, and it was an extremely improbable event. So now I had a type 2 synchronicity, and I said, gee, that's odd, but it had no meaning to me. Tuesday afternoon, I was then teaching a class in a psychology and religion and spirituality class, has about 100 students, and I was giving a lecture that I only give once a year, and it's based on a particular section of a book I wrote called The Afterlife Experiments. And as I was describing this particular event, I was talking about what it's like to do this kind of research, particular research project. And I said, you know, it's difficult enough to do controversial research on life after death. It's even more controversial to say that it was funded and is being shown on an HBO documentary, which it subsequently was, called Life After Life. But I said what's really difficult is to have to explain the name of the company who produced it, which is called Lucky Duck Productions. Now, as soon as I said those words, I actually stopped in the class. And I said, I'm mentioning Lucky Duck in a class. So I stopped and I said, students, later on in the term, we're going to have a conversation about something called synchronicities and how it might be related to consciousness, universal consciousness, and so on. But because the synchronicity is happening right now, I feel intuitively that I should tell you about it. So I told them about these first 4 synchronicities. And I said, if anyone has any thoughts about this, they can talk about it, come to me after class. Well, after class, 2 students came to me and they were very upset. So here's number 5. First student says, Dr. Schwartz, I'm very upset. She says, I don't understand this. She said, but you know, it's pretty warm out today, but for some reason I felt that I should wear this sweater, this heavy sweater that I had in the back of the car. And so I put it on and I came into class. And while you were stopping and talking about the duck, she said, I put my hand in my pocket and look what I found. And she pulls out a little plastic yellow duck, rubber duck. I said, what? I said, how often do you put a little plastic duck in your pocket? She says, never. She said, so I said, how did it get there? She said, well, in the afternoons, to earn extra money, I take care of kids, I babysit, and do some education. And she said, sometimes I take the kids in the car, and they probably left one of these ducks in the car, and I put it in my pocket. She said, but I didn't realize it. Why was it there today? Then another student next to her is now very upset. And he says, oh, I can't believe this. He said, this morning I was in the shower, and I keep my razor in the shower. And I went to find my razor and it wasn't there. And I couldn't shave. So he said, I got out of the shower dripping wet, and I went to see if I could find where did my shaver go? So I walked around the house, he said, and then I went into my daughter's room. And there on the floor, she had my shaver and lined up in a row with 3 rubber ducks. Now, again, how often do you hear of a child, and she had never done this before, lining up 3 rubber ducks? At this point, we had 6 synchronicities. That's a type 3 synchronicity, a super synchronicity. But it had no meaning to me. So that afternoon, after the class, I had a meeting with a master's student, and after we talked about her research, got caught up, I said, look, I said, excuse me, I said, but I'm going to ask you a strange question. Have you had any events in the past few days involving ducks? I'll do that if I'm trying to see whether somehow other things are happening in the environment with me. And she says, yeah, she said, actually, it's very odd. She says, because last night I felt this urge to clean the top of the kitchen cabinet. She says, normally I don't clean the kitchen cabinets. But she said, I went up to the top, and lo and behold, I found this old teapot that had been my mother's, and she had gifted to me, which I had sort of lost track of. And she said, it's a duck teapot. And she said, inspired by that, I decided then to call my son. And it turns out, this is now synchronicities 8 and 9, it turns out his nickname is Ducky. How did he get the nickname Ducky? Well, he got it twice and independently. Now think about this. What are the odds? The first Ducky was when he was a child, and they lived in New England, and they lived near a pond, and the pond would freeze. And sadly, these ducks got frozen in the pond, and the kid was very upset. So the young boy goes out to save the ducks. He falls into the ice water. He's now screaming. The mother hears him, and another man hears him, and they go into the water, and they save the child and the ducks. From that, he became named the Ducky. However, they then moved to Tucson. He went on to become a star quarterback in his Tucson, in his high school. But turned out that he had a very powerful arm, but he wasn't always accurate. And sometimes the coach would tease him, and they would tell the defensive team to duck. So he got re-nicknamed Ducky. So at this point, I said, okay, there are clearly too many ducks, but still, what does it mean? I had no idea. And so the last one, and then we'll end this, I said, coincidentally, we had a meeting that night with a group that I was working with at the time. It was sort of a mediumship development circle. And we were looking at this from a point of view of research. So there was a skilled evidential research medium. There were people who were in training. And then there was myself who was trying to watch the process. And I knew that this, particularly the woman who was teaching this class as evidential research medium, could be very accurate. So I asked her to ask her, quote, guides if they had any idea about what was going on with all these synchronicities. And she sort of claimed to be channeling her guides. And she says, they're telling me that you know what this has to do with. This is very meaningful to you, and you know it. It relates to your past. And I said, no, I don't. I said, I don't have any pet ducks. I didn't collect ducks. I don't have any association with ducks. She kept saying, I'm sorry, Gary, but they're telling me you already know what this is. It's very important to you. And I'm saying, I'm sorry, there's no connection with this. I said, can't you help? And then she said, well, they're telling me if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck and smells like a duck. And all of a sudden, it hit me. Because it turned out that that was the way I actually ended the book called The Afterlife Experiments. And it had to do with the nature of how do we infer the existence of consciousness in someone else or anything else, since the only consciousness we know is our own. In fact, as a psychologist trained during the era of behaviorism, you know, in those days, you couldn't prove that you could think, that you could experience, that you could have emotion. It was always a process of, quote, inference. And that's the way that it works. So in order to, for example, know whether a medium is actually receiving communication from a deceased person, you can't get a direct method unless, of course, you happen to be deceased and then know what's going on. So you have to infer it. And so you look at various types of evidence, triage, or multiple layers. And to the extent they all point in the same direction, you can potentially infer, well, it sounds like she's talking to a formerly physical person, a post-material person. And then I realized that I was probably never going to be able to prove that life after death was real, because how is somebody going to, after they die, prove that their consciousness survived, is they can't prove that they're conscious while they're alive. At best, what we could do is draw the inference from all the different parallel forms, including now neuroscience and physics. Now, what are the odds of all of this happening? I don't have time to take you through this, but you can think this through. Imagine this. Imagine you have 18 of these events occurring over a 6-day period. And each one, if you try to estimate the probability of their spontaneously happening, you realize they're 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000. You could just do the base rates, do the counting. And if you then calculate what's called the conditional probability of all those events in a serial sequence, all within a defined period of time, you end up with something that has anywhere from 30 to 50 zeros going along. Now, what does such a big number mean? And what I realized was that if you imagine the following, so this is what I did. Remember, I'm the experiencer here, and I'm trying to make sense happening around me. And by the way, all of this is being witnessed. I'm taking photographs. I'm doing recordings. This all involves multiple people, so we can rule out misperception. We can rule out fraud. We've got independent confirmatory evidence and so on. I know it's happening. What would happen if I spent my entire life, I never went to sleep, morning, noon, and night, 365 days a year, for 13.7 billion years. Imagine a person was here, present at the moment of the Big Bang, and now they're going to start looking for those kinds of duck synchronicities. How long would it take in order to get 18 of them in a row at that level of improbability to use this particular supersynchronicity? And when you do the calculations, and you can find this, another example in the chapter of my book, it turns out that the length of time it would take is longer than the entire age of the universe. And that's an astronomical improbability. So how do we explain this? How do we explain that there could be levels of order that are existing in the universe, even in human behavior and life, but you have to be able to look for that order and seek that order in order to uncover it? How can we make sense of it? And here's where this is the working hypothesis that I have. And this bridges things that Dean says and Menes has said, and Enid Bernard and others, and I'll draw a parallel to synchronicity. I call it a quantum synchronicity parallel. And here's the phenomena. If we take the double slit experiment and we shoot individual photons of light or individual electrons, what we see on the collector behind these two slits are independent dots, independent particles, quote, independent particles, that they're one at a time. But slowly but surely, these individual particles, which look, quote, random, they look, quote, random, it turns out they're not random, because what they do is they ultimately produce a distribution of particles, what we call an interference pattern, which can be described in terms of wave mechanics. So you have, quote, particles, and they're only particles as we measure them. And yet they organize into something that requires. And Bohm called those pilot waves. He said we have to posit the existence of invisible waves in order to make sense of all of this. Now, what happens if we add intelligence to this? We add meaning to this. We add intention to this. the consequence is maybe we're getting evidence for some sort of super intelligence, some sort of larger intelligence, and that intelligence has to be part of the fabric from the micro to the macro. So that's how exploring synchronicity takes me to a primacy of consciousness. It takes me to higher dimensions. It takes me to higher intelligences, and it humbles me. And it leads me to be more inspired by the nature of the universe and our capacity to be part of that, to be co-creative in all of that, to potentially understand all of that. And I think, by the way, that one of the many things that come out of this conference would be to develop some large-scale research projects with all the participants, members of the scientific medical networks and IONS and so on, that maybe could do collaborative work, for example, in the area of synchronicity, because we've never been able to collect a really large database on people who actually are fairly sophisticated or are along the path of these kinds of experiences. And the last thing I'd like to do is to repeat something that Julia said, and that is that if you've been privileged to be on this path and you've been educated to go beyond the way you were originally raised, the dogma that you so thought it just assumed was true, we should have compassion for those who have not yet had those experiences or are going to be threatened by those kinds of data as part of their own transformation. With that, I say thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Gary. I must say I myself am fascinated in synchronicities. I have my own book of synchronicities, but I've never heard a synchronicity about a duck before, and certainly not with so many levels of coincidence. Yeah. Now, I have to say that we're somewhat behind schedule. Several our panelists have had more than their 10 minutes each, but I think the participants will agree that it was worth it. But we are now going to have first of all, a little dialogue between the panelists themselves before going on to the participation by the audience. What I would like to do, I would like to try and connect your three talks, because we've heard, we heard about synchronicities, which is all to do with time, from Gary. We heard about non-locality from Stefan, which is all to do with space. And we heard all about higher dimensions, which in some sense is transcending space and time, from Ed. So what I would like to now do is to invite you to somehow link your three talks together. And so I don't want to put you on the spot, but I mean, I do think before we get into a bigger discussion, it's quite an important issue. So first of all, could I ask you, Stefan and Ed, and Gary indeed, if you would like to contribute to the topic, what is the link between non-locality and quantum theory, which is also famously, referring to the non-locality which is associated with entanglement and things like that. So you're coming at it from different directions, and I'll bring you in later, Gary. But could I first ask Gary and Stefan to see if they're coming at this problem in compatible ways? Stefan is saying you have to have non-locality. You in some sense have to transcend space, transcend time, but people who take the hyperspatial approach say, well, what we're doing is we're just going to a higher dimensional space. So you're not getting away from space and time altogether, you're just going to a higher dimensional space and time. So I would just like the two of you to have that little dialogue for a few minutes. So would either Ed or Stefan like to start?
Stefan, you want to begin? I do have a comment.
Of course, Gary.
Okay. Well, I mean, as I said, like many of us, I read many of the quantum papers that try to address this issue. I'm not a physicist, so this is not my special area of competence. I actually have my greatest interest, and in fact, an experimental study that I am just planning. I want to look at how non-local consciousness becomes conscious, because there are two studies, one by Gene Ochterberg and one by a man named Jung Beeman, that suggests that the anterior superior temporal gyrus of the brain are activated when a non-local consciousness experience occurs. Now, that's just very tentative, first steps. I'm not sure how, and I will defer to Ed, I'm not sure how quantum processes link with non-local consciousness. I mean, I am sure that they do in some way. I think of non-local consciousness as a kind of information architecture in which the acts of intentioned awareness are informational enrichers. And the experimental evidence supports that. That things which, as I said, are the focus of more acts of intentioned awareness are easier to perceive, and we see that in the remote viewing research, and we also see that in the therapeutic intention, the healing research. Ed and Vernon's Gimmel idea is, I think, very interesting. I'm not quite sure how to test it experimentally, but that's probably my limitation, not their theory. I think what seems critical to me is that we understand that acts of conscious awareness, particularly when they are interlinked and held in common, have the capacity to change the circumstances of our lives. To me, the two mystery questions are, for which I don't have answers, are what is consciousness and what is information? Because when you acquire information, for instance, I discovered Cleopatra's Palace and Mark Antony's Palace and the Lighthouse of Pharos, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. It was a triple blind experiment. Nobody had any idea where they were. Nobody had known for centuries where they were. So when a remote viewer accurately locates them and then describes in detail exactly what would be found when we went there, because the remote viewing work I do is not a searching technique, it's a locating technique. There's a distinction. So where is that information? When you get information from a communicant who is no longer corporeal, where is that information? When, as in the reincarnation research, you incarnate with a birthmark or a wound scar, that information that shaped literally the physical body, your physical body, where was that information? When Edgar Cayce, for instance, describes in great detail something that nobody, for instance, this is what got me started in this. I read a reading of Edgar Cayce's given in 1936 where he said, it was for a woman, and he said she was a member of the Essene community and a teacher of astrology. And before I got drafted into the Army, I had been working for National Geographic, and the last article that I had done for them was on the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I knew that in 1936, there wasn't a human on Earth that knew that the Dead Sea Scrolls existed, or that that Khirbet Qumran was an Essene community. And yet in 1947, when a young Bedouin tribes boy was chucking rocks in a cave and heard something go clunk and went down into the cave and found the amphora which contained the scrolls, and the scrolls are obsessed with astrology, How could Casey possibly have known that 11 years earlier, since nobody on our Earth knew that? Where is that information?
Okay. I accept that the information is absolutely
Yeah.
crucial. I think that's the link. Before bringing in Ed and Gary, I'd just like to say, Stefan, that I think you're putting the emphasis on the problem of non-locality. From my perspective, the real problem is locality. If
Yes.
one accepts that there is only one consciousness, which is the view which one is coming to from many of these perspectives, the real problem is if there's only one consciousness, how is it that I am localized in this brain? Why am I, Bernard, different from you, Stefan? And to me, that's the real problem. And I'm very happy with non-locality. It's locality which is the problem. And I'm saying that maybe that will prompt a response, I don't know, from Ed. So over to you, Ed.
Yes, let me see if I can connect the dots here. It's interesting. I agree with most of what Stefan says, and the importance of information. But we actually are all modelers. This has been touched upon before in the other discussions, that we take in all this information. I think it was Diane said, and our brain, we have the loop there that it keeps connecting. There are far more paths in the brain between comparing things than there are input or output. And this process goes on, and the brain creates this image of the world or map of the world. It's a model. We are all modelers. Now, if we're modeling something, how do we observe and how do we measure it? Stefan mentioned it's an architecture and its intent. Well, the very word architecture suggests dimensions and suggests geometry. And the question about where are these things and how do we know them, and how did Edgar Cayce know what happened with this particular individual as a person in the time of the Essenes, that sort of thing. If you look at the whole model as a model of dimensionometry, geometry is 3 dimensions in space and 1 dimension in time. What we found is reflecting the structure of pure mathematics, time is also 3-dimensional. Now, most people said, I actually discussed this with Stephen Hawking in 88 or 89. And he said he couldn't imagine 3-dimensional time. But actually, it works out quite well, because dimensions, we have to talk in terms of dimensional domains. And for instance, space alone is 3-dimensional domain, but it has 1-dimensional domains and 2-dimensional domains embedded within it. There's a 4th-dimensional domain. It's space, the 3 dimensions of time, or space, and 1 of time. And that works out very well. But as I mentioned briefly earlier, people like Kaluza and Klein looked at 5 dimensions, and actually Wolfgang Pauli, who Einstein considered a genius, Wolfgang Pauli actually did a 6-dimensional model. And what he found was, in that 6-dimensional model, there turned out to be what he called phenomena that were non-physical. Well, that's because of our senses. Our physical senses are only aware of 3 dimensions. Now, if what it turns out mathematically is there are 3 dimensions of time, 3 dimensions of space, 3 dimensions of time, and 3 dimensions of consciousness. But these larger dimensional domains all include the smaller dimensional domains in them. They are embedded, kind of like the Russian dolls or something like that. But actually, it's more than that. It's then you get all the way through to the 9th dimension. You run out of mathematics except to go into the transfinite and the infinite. So we have 9 dimensions embedded in infinity. So one of the things that a lot of people who study quantum physics a lot say, well, we may have to change our notion of time. Well, if our notion of time is wrong, and there's not an arrow really, except in the way our minds organize things to develop our model, then we really can start to understand if time is the 4th dimension, then within each one of these time domains, there's a whole physical domain that's embedded within it. They're all changing relative to that particular time. But suppose the only way you can be aware of a domain is to move one domain beyond it. So if you have an n-dimensional domain, the only way for instance, if the only way you can see a plane is to move into the 3rd dimension, a plane is 2-dimensional. So only way you can see 3 dimensions actually and experience them is to consciously be aware of the 4th dimension, which is time. Now, if there's a 5th dimension of time, let's suppose that each one of us, by the distinctions we draw consciously, create a timeline. But those timelines, if you have 2 of them and they're not coincident, then you have a 4th dimension. The only way you can see that 3rd dimension or the 4th dimension is to be in the 5th dimension. Now, a person who is conscious of the 5th dimension will see the timelines of other people. This explains why you have people who can look at a person, like one of the earlier speakers said, and tell them about their past and their future, perhaps, and that sort of thing, because it's a matter of expanded consciousness into extra dimensions.
Okay,
So
Ed, I'm going to have to cut you. Yeah.
Sure, go ahead.
Well, I want to cut you off quite soon so Gary has a chance to come in. So if you could just round
Sure.
off your point quite quickly.
That was pretty much it. I was about to an end that dimensions are all embedded within each other, and if you consciously expand your awareness to a higher dimension, if you're totally conscious of where you are, then you are also aware of the dimensional domains, let's say, that have a fewer number of dimensions that are embedded within it. So this can explain all sorts of psi phenomena.
Thank you for that, Ed. And I would just like to, in a sense, back up what you're saying by saying that, you know, the hyperspatial approach to explaining mind and mental and paranormal phenomena is very old. I mean, it goes all the way back to Flatland, you know, in the 19th century. But the difference now is that physicists themselves talk about higher dimensions. You know, so now in string theory and M theory, it's routine to entertain the concept that you've got these extra dimensions which we cannot perceive directly. And as some people might know, my own approach is very much motivated by this idea too, that if you've got these extra dimensions, and if the physical world is just a slice in a high dimensional space, you're bound to ask, well, what else exists in this high dimensional space? And it seems to me very natural to say that these high dimensions are in fact what you require to accommodate mental experience, be it normal, paranormal, or spiritual. And I also agree with you that whatever these extra dimensions are, they have to have something to do with time. because it's not just a matter of exospatial dimensions. You need other times. Now, whether they're 3 times, as you're saying, or something more complicated, I don't know. But I think that once you get to the question of understanding precognitions, and indeed, even if you want to address the question which I asked of Stefan, how do you explain the fact that there are billions of these individual consciousnesses, even though there's only one ultimate consciousness? I feel the only resolution of that problem is to change your concept of time. You have to go beyond the simple one-dimensional picture of time. And in a way, Gary, I think this leads on to you, because when we start talking about coincidences and synchronicities, we are really talking about, I suppose, the equivalent of non-locality in time.
Yes.
So can I maybe ask you, I think you will probably have to be the last person to speak before the breakup, but would you like to say something along those lines?
I would love to. First of all, I love hearing the if you would, the more abstract mathematical and physical inventions that we have to create in order to explain phenomena. Remember, that's what physics does, and that's what mathematics does. Based on observation, we then create theory, and then we invent new ideas in order to explain that which we observe. So what justifies creating, in part, any new model, in higher dimensions which go beyond our normal consciousness, so on and so forth, I feel very comfortable about that, because that is the nature of how we advance. We're constantly going beyond that of our traditional senses. Now, having said that, if we add a couple of variables here and concepts, such as, for example, holographic phenomena, we add concepts of information and energy of being distributed in space and time. If we take what Larry Dossey talked about, where what he means by non-local consciousness is he means infinite consciousness, and he means infinite in quote space and infinite in time. And then you add universal and you add holographic to that. That helps explain even the existence of matter itself. Because what we've been observing in data is that consciousness plays a role in, quote, the collapse of the wave function. Awareness and processing of information. It reduces entropy. So if consciousness and intent, what Stephen calls intention consciousness, and I would add intelligent intention consciousness, can be infinitely engaged. In other words, there's consciousness everywhere at both higher and lower levels, then everything is being held in consciousness. And that consciousness, that infinite consciousness, allows for the constant, if you would, collapse of the wave function. In other words, it's a constant molding of organizing energy and information through this, if you would, living, dynamic, universal consciousness. And so for me, that's the way that I could go from the quantum and the micro and the many levels of dimensions of space and time to something that could be so ultra macro and be, quote, universal, and therefore allow for the, quote, special cases. And to me, the grand miracle is not the universal consciousness. The grand miracle is localized, organized, and stabilized matter and information.
Exactly. Well, thank you for that last remark. I especially resonate with, Gary. But I would like to thank all 3 of the panelists, because I'm really excited, because I think your talks actually link up in a very nice way. And although I know you're approaching it from different directions, I think there's a compatibility. I mean, I think that Stefan, was put his finger on it when he talked about information. I think information is the key, it's the link, but I think the information itself has a dimensionality, and in some sense, in an abstract sense, one needs a higher dimensional information space than the normal, 3+1 dimensional space of normal physics. At least that's my own interpretation. I have my own model, so I'm obviously a little bit biased. Now, according to the program, we now have a break. Now, I have to say that the plan of having a breakout, I believe, has been ditched. There's been a breakdown, because if I understand Andrew correctly, the breakout sessions aren't working. Is that correct?
They're not working
Correct.
as well as they need to now. So we're a little bit behind schedule anyway. So I think it makes
I
sense.
know. And to be honest, I assumed that there was a breakdown in the breakout, because in allowing the discussion to go on. But I see, according to there's now a 5-minute break, and then there's a presentation about ions.
That's right.
So I think this perhaps is a good, just before you go, before everybody goes for the 5-minute break, can I remind people who want to ask questions to put them in the chat box with a capital letter start, a capital question at the beginning, so I can identify, because I'm terrible at reading chat and listening. I can't do both things at the same time, but it's really helpful if having this question in capital letters. That'll help me to isolate the important questions to ask after the presentation about ions. So David, do you want to come in to sort of close the session for 5 minutes, or should I just
let's have a break, and then we'll come back for some questions, and then I'll have some remarks right at the end.
Yes, so we'll break for 5 minutes, so we come back at 8:10, and then we'll have the ions presentation. Is that correct?
Yes, Claudia Wells is going to say something.
Wonderful.
She's the chair of the board of IONS. I sent you an email about it.
Okay, great. So we will now then we will have a break for 5 minutes until 8:10.
Great.
Thank you. So, David, who is giving the presentation from IONS?
Claudia Wells.
Claudia, right. So is Claudia there?
Let's see. Here we go. Claudia, I'm just making you a co-host. And if you could unmute now, please.
Got it. Hello, everyone.
Welcome.
Thank you. What an amazing couple of days. I would like to thank you for this opportunity. It's a pleasure to represent IONS, where Dean Radin, who spoke earlier, is our chief scientist, and where, as you said, I'm board chair, and where I knew the founders of IONS and had the privilege to work alongside many of them. Of course, IONS was founded by Captain Edgar Mitchell, who went to the moon on Apollo 14 and had an epiphany in space about the nature of consciousness. That consciousness was primary and causal in the entire universe. And he felt he knew this because he had a visceral experience of oneness. It wasn't an intellectual understanding, and we've been talking about the important distinction that is yesterday. So instead, it was this direct experience that seeing Earth from space gave him. And I knew Edgar for many years, but I was introduced to IONS by then President Willis Harman, who many of you may know, actually. He was another engineer and a former senior social scientist at Stanford Research Institute. And I'd been working at UC Berkeley with corporations at the time. I was trying to change the paradigm of business, which, of course, as we were saying yesterday, is built on this system of economics that relies on materialism. And Willis found out what I was trying to do and told me that I was addressing symptom rather than cause by trying to transform business, while it's based on this economic system that's based on materialism. And that what they were doing at IONS was addressing cause, which they believed was the level of consciousness giving rise to all of these systems based on separation, because IONS theorized that consciousness was primary and causal. When Edgar came back from the moon in 71, he founded IONS in 73. Bernard mentioned earlier the significance of the 70s. And it was because he wanted to know what happened to him in space, what gave him that epiphany. Because, of course, he was also scientifically trained in materialism. And he wanted to apply the same scientific precision that he knew was being applied to get him to the moon, the same scientific precision that was being applied to understanding outer space, to understanding inner space. And because he founded IONS, it's been here for curious people to find for the last almost 50 years. And we use scientific exploration and personal discovery to push beyond the current limits of human understanding and help reveal the true interconnected, or I'd even say unified nature of reality that can help explain all the, quote unquote anomalies that we've been discussing. Our main ways of doing that currently include IONS X, which is our application-driven research program to demonstrate practical examples of consciousness affecting our physical world. And this includes 2 projects we referenced yesterday and one again today, the genetics of psychic ability, and what is now a collaboration between IONS, HeartMath's Global Coherence Initiative, and the Global Consciousness Project, which basically represents a Global Consciousness Project 2.0. And another program is the IONS Discovery Lab, where we're studying people's transformative experiences to unlock the mechanisms of transformation so we can learn how to amplify its effects. And both of these projects, all of our projects, are meant to help shift culture. And the last thing I'd like to share with this precious opportunity, thank you again, is related to a dominant theme today, especially earlier today, where we talked a lot about universal love and its implications for healing, or what I'd call holing, because our founder, Edgar Mitchell's epiphany in space showed him that what he called agape love, what's also known as unconditional love, and I would call it today universal love, is the organizing principle of the entire universe. And so I just really wanted to end on that note, and really so appreciative for the opportunity and for the last couple of days and for everything you're doing. Thank you.
Claudia, thank you so much for that. I have to say, I attended the session you had last week about the Mitchell's experience coming back from the moon, and it was a really a wonderful occasion. So thank you for that occasion as well. Also, your speaking reminds me that I believe I'm right in saying that both IONS and the Scientific and Medical Network were founded in the same year, in 1973. I think this is the point you were making at the start.
Oh, that's wonderful, yes.
Which is itself a wonderful synchronicity, which I hadn't appreciated until now.
It truly is.
Particularly appropriate that we should be joining forces in this meeting. So thank you very much for that. I think now we will return to the panelists and continue the discussion. Now, at this point, I'm going to start monitoring I've been looking at some of the questions which have been coming in on the chat line. And there's so many, it's very hard for me to sort of obviously mention all of them. I'm just going to take a few of the questions and see if one or more of the panelists would like to react to them. Some of these might end up being a little bit technical, but I'll ask them anyway. According to dimensionalism, is there a maximum number of dimensions? And if there is, what dictates it? For example, 3 + 1 dimensions for physical theorists corresponds to conserved quantities. What would be the extra dimensions bring in? Would it be meaning or qualia? So, I mean, that's quite in a sense, a technical question. How many, I suppose this is mainly addressed to you, Ed, if we've got extra dimensions, how many are there? And are you relating those extra dimensions to things like meaning and qualia, which obviously relates to synchronicity as well? Maybe that's a question for you, Ed.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'll answer it this way. Mathematics, which is a bad word to most people, as you know, a lot of people, the minute you put an equation in a book or on the screen, they find something more interesting to do. So people, and I blame our educational system for that, because mathematics is a way to understand the elegance of the universe. My position is that mathematics is not an invention. Mathematics exists. Now, the notation is an invention. The symbols are invention, but the logic, the systematic logic, is not. It exists the same way a landscape exists. And most people think of mathematics just as numbers, but remember, geometry is a mathematical subject as well. And logic is, and symbolic logic and mathematics are closely related. In fact, they should never be separated, in my opinion. So when we look at the structure of pure mathematics, and we look at what I call dimensional extrapolation, when we move from one domain, say a three-dimensional or a four-dimensional domain, into the next, we can actually rotate and project into another dimension. And when we do, we find that every set of three dimensions, just like three dimensions of space, there's another type of measurement or number that has to be used in order to extend into the next domain, higher dimensional domain. So it changes every three. After three of space, it becomes much more subtle in three dimensions of time, and then the three dimensions of consciousness are even much more subtle. This is not a linear progression, it's a exponential progression. So the additional dimensions, which make larger domains, is harder and harder to explain and to understand, since our consciousness is okay. So our consciousness is limited through our senses, through the physical senses. I would maintain that they are only just parts of a greater sense that puts everything together. And if you see enough of the dimensions and the higher dimensions, you realize that drawing distinctions and making distinctions and experiencing them at higher levels is different than just making symbols. But my point is that the mathematics is very specific. You have to go from, in the quantum world, from integers in the first three dimensions to what unfortunately was called imaginary numbers in the fourth dimension of time. Time should really be measured relative to three dimensions of space as multiples of the square root of -1. Anytime you see a imaginary number arising, it's telling you you're bumping up or you're coming in contact with an extra dimension, one more than the dimensions you started with in your model.
So can I?
So
yeah.
it changes. Yes, go ahead. It changes every three. So
Exactly. So I wanted to ask you. Yeah. I just wanted to ask you to be more explicitly then. The question was, what's the maximum number of dimensions? And if I understand things, you're saying it goes up in three. So you've got three space, three time, three consciousness. Is that where it stops, or does it go on beyond that? Another three?
The only thing we can measure when it goes beyond that, we're in what George Cantor called extra dimension, what he called infinities. And so it changes after 9. So in a sense, I would say, for all practical purposes, for everything that we want to describe mathematically and in a dimensional model, I call it dimensionometry because it goes beyond what we usually think of as geometry. You only need the 9. When you get past that, you're in the transfinite and the infinite. So in a sense, I would say there are only 9 dimensions. That's not really true. There are further dimensions, higher dimensions, but we can't describe them within the mathematical system.
And is it a fair statement to say that the key message of this is that there are levels of reality that go beyond the simple space-time reality, and that there's like a hierarchy of levels of consciousness, which in having more advanced experiences, in some sense, are accessing higher dimensions. Is that right? So there's a sort of hierarchy of dimensions which you may access according to your state of consciousness.
Yeah.
Very briefly.
Yes. Mike mentioned that the reason not everybody is a Christ conscious being or a Buddha or the other individuals who had non-local consciousness, in other words, higher dimensional consciousness, is because we're all progressing in this, and we only see sometimes a person who might be able to see another person's past lives or something may not be able to see other things. So in a sense, you could have only an awareness of, say, 3 dimensions of space, 2 of time, and 1 of consciousness. But I would say any conscious being actually has awareness of 5 dimensions, 3 of space, 1 of time, and 1 of consciousness.
Okay, thank you, Ed. I'm going to cut you off at that point. I have to ask the speakers to be quite brief because we've only got a little time left, and I myself tend to talk too much, so I will impose that on myself as well. The next question, I think, is for Gary, maybe, although anyone is welcome to comment on it. The question here, I'm afraid I don't remember the name of who asked the question, but just a question. Where does free will fit in with the concept of synchronicity, which seems to suggest that there is a global interconnection of consciousness, a universal coordinated path? Does it suggest that free will is an illusion and that we are all being pushed and pulled by some kind of higher order consciousness, super intelligence? So I guess that's either Gary or Stefan. Gary.
I'll do a quick one. The answer is it's not either or, it's an and. In fact, I would suggest that the universal consciousness created the capacity for relative independence so there could be relative freedom of will at the same time there was higher organizations and which we can become either more or less synchronous with. That's a 1-minute answer.
Okay.
To be quick.
That's fine. And I don't know whether Stefan wants to give a 1-minute answer. How does free will
I guess I have to say, Bernard, I'm an experimentalist. And so I don't quite see how to do an experiment that can give me an objectively verifiable answer to that question. What I tend to think of is that what we call reality is kind of like we are avatars in a video game. It's clear that the eternal self, what religion calls the soul, episodically manifests for a variety of reasons another personality form, another information structure, which incarnates and sets in motion, but through the choices that it makes, information patterns, and that we are the aggregate of all the information patterns that our various personalities have completed.
Is that saying we're living in a simulation? I mean, it seems to be quite close to that.
Yes, I think actually the more I look at again, I'm an experimentalist, so I look at experimental evidence. I'm not a theoretician. When I look at the experimental evidence, more and more, it seems to me that it is very much like being your personality, Bernard Carr, is very much like being an avatar in a video game that your eternal self, if you will, is playing.
It's fascinating. I'm not particularly an advocate of the simulation view, although I do all think you know, it's a dream in that sense of the
Well, I
universal
didn't know.
mind.
I don't know that I didn't say it was a simulation.
Mm.
What I said was what appears to be reality seems to be a construct of intentioned consciousness. And that we have the ability by manipulating intentioned consciousness, whether at the individual level, like a healing experiment, or at a global level, like Roger's Global Consciousness Project, we have the ability to manipulate the structure of reality through intentioned consciousness. That's as far as I would be willing to take it.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, and I think we'll perhaps leave it at that point because obviously that discussion could continue
For
for
hours.
time. There's now a question. Again, this might be a little bit technical, but I'm interested as a physicist. Would a more realistic model of time allow for us to see what happens in the quantum world? Would Heisenberg's uncertainty principle be overridden due to observations of several factors in the same time? And I found that a very interesting question because I do think, you know, a lot of people think that quantum theory is going to explain mind, you know, and paranormal phenomena. And I have to express my own view that quantum theory cannot do that. I mean, quantum theory is important for hinting that consciousness plays an important role in physics, but I don't think it can, you know, it can aspire to explain mental experience. It can't explain a near-death experience. It can't explain most of the aspects of mentality. And I think this was a view which Minas Kapitos, for example, expressed very clearly yesterday. However,
Bernard, let me say one thing.
of course,
I think that if the role of quantum processes, I agree with you, by the way, with what you just said. It would seem to me that the role of quantum processes may, I emphasize the may part, may explain how non-local consciousness enters into space-time. And as I said, I'm actually interested in what, if we can identify a part of the brain, the part of our neuroanatomy, which is activated when non-local consciousness acquisition occurs.
I agree, and that's a really interesting. You said you're an experimentalist, and that's a really important question to address.
Can I enter in?
Yeah, yes, come into that too, Ed.
Yes, interesting. I really appreciate and I'm fascinated by the knowledge that that Stefan has, and appreciate the experimentalist. But I'm a theorist, and I admit to that and confess to it, and I will justify it by saying data is just data until consciousness does something with it. And the best way to do anything with it is to have a theory. Now, that theory may change with new data, and it should, but that's my feeling is that we have to have a more comprehensive model and a mathematical model and a theory within which everything will fit. And if it doesn't fit, then we have to go back to the incompleteness theorem and say it doesn't fit in our model, so our model is incomplete. So our model needs to be expanded. And the way we can do this is to expand it dimensionally. And yes, I think then we do begin to be able to explain some of the quantum effects that are considered weird because we're not aware of the higher dimensionality that's at work here. I can give an example, but I don't want to take
No. Let's not, because we're running out of time. I think the point you're making is really important, though, that we often talk about the bridge between science and religion, but there are many other bridges. One of the important bridges is the bridge between experiment and theory. And science itself needs that bridge, and it's not a bridge which is always easy to make. There's some people who say, well, I won't believe your theory until I've got your experimental results. There are other people who say, well, I won't believe your experimental results until you've got the theory. And the latter approach is what the skeptics of science say. They say, I don't believe your results in sci because you don't have a theory. And that's why you need a theory. And so you need this balance between the theory and the experiment and the theory. But I mean, to answer the question specifically, I mean, and I think that Stefan was agreeing with me, quantum theory does not give the full picture. It's part of the picture. It's not the full picture.
Yes, I agree.
What we really need is a deeper theory which underlies both quantum theory and mind and mentality and consciousness. And then that deeper theory, I'm sure, will elucidate, the nature of consciousness and the nature of non-locality. And that's why I thought, and I personally think, though I could be wrong, I personally think that a higher dimensional approach can also give you a new insights into the nature of quantum theory. But that's very speculative, so I don't want to push that anymore. But thank you all for those interesting answers. We're beginning to run out of time. There's a more practical question here, which I quite like, if I can find it. There appears to be a converging consensus of a theory of psi, matter and consciousness, however it is defined. Given money is no object, what experiment would the panel like to do to confirm or refute this? So maybe that's a sort of more practical way. In other words, Ed, if you were given £1 billion, how would you use it to prove their higher dimensions? Or Gary or Stefan, how would you use your $1 billion to further the field? I know it's a very broad question, but I mean, just to... maybe I should ask you first, Ed, how would you prove the existence of these extra dimensions?
Well, I really believe there is a way to do that. Can I describe one?
Yes, as long as it's less than a minute.
Yeah,
$1 billion a minute.
I think that in order to answer that question, we need a team like maybe Stefan and myself to work out the way to, and Gary's excellent at and Dean Radin at creating experiments to prove things that are theoretical. So that's definitely needed. I can't tell you what I would do without getting into more detail, but I would do something with it.
I mean, Ed, if they discover higher dimensions at the Large Hadron Collider, which they were trying to do, indeed at a cost of billions of dollars, would you associate the extra dimensions discovered at the Hadron Collider with mental experience, which on the face of it is a rather crazy thing to suggest?
Yes. The short answer is yes, and the reason that I answer yes is because, as I mentioned earlier, I believe that the mathematics of dimensionality is as real as a landscape to be found and if it's found in the Large Hadron Collider, then it will, I believe, shed light on the psi phenomena we're talking about.
Okay, thank you for that, Ed. And Gary and Stefan, how would you spend your $1 billion?
Well, again, I feel like I'm a simple guy. It's not, I'm experiments are what I care about. I would like to know how non-local consciousness manifests in space-time. And I would start, in fact, that's what I'm planning. I would get a neuroscientist who's got access to an fMRI, and I would start looking at extensions of the work that Achterberg and Jung Beeman and several others did That's one thing. And the other thing I would like to know is how many people, we know, for instance, from the experimental work that when 10% of any cohort, whether it's a school committee or a nation, changes consciousness about something, that the whole cohort has to accommodate to that. And so I would like to see how we could understand our place in the matrix of consciousness. I mean, if everything is an expression of consciousness, as Planck said, and I think he's right, but not just Planck, but many others, then the question that I have is, how do you manipulate reality in a way that fosters well-being?
That's the sociological aspect of it, yeah.
Well, as I said, I'm a simple, practical guy. Can we develop experiments? It's clear that when you have an aggregate of intentioned consciousness, that you can change society. And there are lots of examples. I don't want to, it's too much time.
And $1 billion,
However,
yeah.
that said, the question I would like to know is, how does that non-local consciousness, that intention, how does that enter into an individual's neuroanatomy, and how can we learn to manipulate that to foster well-being?
Okay. And Gary, you just have 1 minute for your $1 billion.
Sure. My experience has been that any question that can be asked properly can be investigated scientifically. The trick is to be able to ask the question clearly, and then, as Ed notes, be creative about how one addresses it experimentally. And my hunch is, if I had $1 billion, I would bring some of the most skilled and creative minds, both senior people, including common people like Stephen Schwartz, as well as more theoretical types, as well as young people, together, and have the whole's greater than the sum of its parts. Now, there are particular questions that I would love to see answered, such as, to what extent can you teach people to connect with the universal consciousness? Can you document that people can get accurate information that is universal across individuals? What role does, for example, love and compassion play in the process of being able to interconnect? To what extent does resonating with higher source lead to greater health and greater capability? I mean, there's so many questions, each of which can be addressed and answered, just like we approach the Hebrew letters or almost anything else. And I think that time is approaching.
And the reason keep mentioning $1 billion, it wasn't really just a joke. I mention that because when you look at the amount of money that goes into scientific research in astronomy or particle physics, the typical cost of an experiment is about $1 billion. Well, 100 million for a telescope. You're 100 million if it's and it now goes up towards $1 billion. The Large Hadron Collider. So, I mean, and David, when we show this image of the telescope, in the Galileo Commission thing, looking through the telescope, that telescope typically costs $1 billion. Okay, and the point I'm making is that the money which can be currently devoted to post-materialist science is tiny compared to that. So when people say to psychical researchers, well, after 100 years, how little you've achieved, well, that's because the amount of money and manpower and woman power that has gone into this area of research is tiny compared to conventional psychology or conventional physics. Yep. So it seems to me that what is going to make post-materialist science successful, apart from the great ideas, is ultimately going to be backing, which will involve money. And as I said, a typical experiment now is 100 million to $1 billion. And so I wasn't being entirely, farcical when I asked you what you would do with $1 billion, because that's the amount of money most sciences need now, to make progress. I mean, look at the amount of billions of dollars which have been spent developing the vaccination, to cure COVID, etc. Anyway, I hope that's an optimistic, well, assuming we get the $1 billion, I hope that's an optimistic note on which to end this discussion. I notice we are now running, we're now 14 minutes past the scheduled ending time for this discussion. So I think I better now bring this discussion session to a close. But I'm very sorry for all those people. There were so many interesting questions in the chat, which I simply didn't have time to almost read, let alone to pass on to the speakers. But I think all the questions in the chat will be preserved for all eternity, if I understand correctly, so we can still go back and look at them, and the participants, the panelists, can go back and look at them and maybe answer them later. But at this point, I would just like to thank Ed and Stefan and Gary for well, for me at least, and I hope for everybody, has been a wonderful session. I mean, you've all approached these problems from a different direction, and I think we've sort of got an amalgamation of them, which is being really very elucidating. So thank you so much for participating in this session. And so now I think myself and David are going to say some final words in holding the whole meeting. But over to you, David, at this point. You can...
No, I think if you don't mind, Bernard, if you'd like to say your word first. Then
okay, certainly. So now I'm just now talking in my capacity, not, well, I suppose as the SMN president rather than as the chair of the last session. I mean, I started off by saying that this is a tremendously exciting time to be the president of the Scientific and Medical Network. I'm just so humbled and privileged to have the role, because we're nearly 50 years old. I mean, it's, well, in 2023, we'll be celebrating our 50th anniversary, as will IONS, and I hope that will be a good opportunity to come together again for a really big celebration. Both our organizations have existed a long time. I mean, the AAPS is obviously more recent. But I think it's not an exaggeration to say that this is probably one of the most important initiatives the SMN has ever been involved in, the Galileo Commission and the post-materialist science. And of course, it's not just the SMN. It's, as you will realize, it's all these other organizations as well. And what's so exciting is that this meeting has brought together, well, the Scientific and Medical Network, IONS, the Galileo Commission, and the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Science. And I think that is what's so exciting. You know, it's bringing us together from all over the world. Now, another interesting thing is that in some sense, this meeting has been rather US based, because obviously most of the presenters have been in the US. But of course, this is a worldwide activity. And if I may, I would just like to advertise the fact that next Saturday, exactly a week from today, the Society for Psychical Research, with which I'm also associated, we are organizing a study day on a similar theme. David, can I just share
yeah, sure.
I have to share my screen, so I'm just going to put up the program. So I now have to share screen, so I hope this works. Okay, so can people see my screen now?
Yes.
So that it's hosted by the Society for Psychical Research, which in a sense is a sister organization of the Scientific and Medical Network, except we go back much further. We go back to 1882, so we're 130 years old. But this is a study day on post-materialist science, the search for a new paradigm. So very much along the lines of this weekend's meeting. There will be contributions from David Lorimer, an invitation to look through the telescope, hopefully $1 billion telescope. Harold Wallach, who of course was the person who wrote this famous Galileo Commission report, and then Brian Josephson, of course the Nobel Prize winning physicists. I'm pleased to relate that at least there are a few other physicists who are very keen on making the link between physics and consciousness. He'll be talking about shaping the post-materialist science. And then Evelyn Elsaesser will be talking about spontaneous and direct after-death communications, bearing, of course, more to the spiritual and survival issue. So that's next Saturday. And if you want further information about that, you can. I will put the link into the chat box. Is it already there, Andrew, or should I put it in myself?
Uh,
Is the link already there? Or I'll put it in myself.
Yes, if you can, that would be great, Bernard.
Okay,
Thank you.
I will do that sort of when I've finished making these remarks. I can't talk and put it there at the same time, else
We can send the link out with our resources and recordings as well.
Okay, that would also be good. So really, that's what I wanted to say, and I want to also, of course, congratulate the authors of these two great books. I know we're celebrating Is Consciousness Primary, which I believe has already come out, but I know that the second volume, which I think was called Expanding Science, will I think be coming out fairly soon as well. So it's going to be a double feast.
Already out.
Oh, it's already out. So the food is still hot, but it only remains for you to consume it anyway. So and I think I hope we have another meeting to celebrate Expanding Science. Now, since it's also the last session, I should also just make a few remarks thanking people. I know David will sort of make remarks as well. Obviously, I have to thank Andrew, who's in charge of the everything. I mean, the audio visual aids. Without Andrew, none of this would have worked. It's all worked splendidly. I mean, it's true that sometimes the breakout broke down, but that's fine, because if it's not one pleasure, it's another. And I'm sure the other discussion we had instead was also very valuable. I myself had no role in organising this, so that means I'm not completely certain who is the person I should be most thanking. But it's clear that Marjorie Woolacott, who is I know the current president of the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Science, I understand was the person who was also very much involved in organising all of this event. So many thanks to you as well, Marjorie. I know that I should be thanking all the editors of the two volumes, but my understanding is that Stefan Schwartz has played a particular role in promoting these two volumes. I know that's involved you in a lot of work, quite apart from the editors themselves. A lot of you obviously have been involved in contributing. So thank you to you, Stefan, for that. And I think I hope I haven't missed anyone, but the other person I really have to thank, because I know he won't thank himself, is David, of course. David is the person who has put this, obviously with the help of other people, but David is very much the person who's put this event together, and he compares the whole event wonderfully. I've never... And I have to say that this is just one of many events David organises for the Scientific and Medical Network. I mean, as David has probably said or will say, there is a continual stream of Scientific and Medical Network events, all of which seem to be organised by David, and he just does such a wonderful job. And you've done a wonderful job being the overseer of this meeting, David. I think you want to say something as well, do you, about that, Stefan?
No, I want to point out that these books exist because Gary was the real impetus behind this.
Okay. And Gary, so I know you were the first president as well of the AAPS. So you, Gary, are also the person who, I mean, to be honest, I don't know who gets the prime. I know that the editor of this first volume, I know is both Gary, Stefan, and Marjorie. So maybe, all three of you, are responsible for this great achievement.
We've all contributed.
You've all contributed, and it's very hard for me to say who deserves you all deserve the credit. So I think that's the best way to leave it. But I want to end up by saying the primary thanks, I think, for this meeting is to you, David. So thank you so much for helping, and with all the other people who helped. Thank you. And to all the other organizations, because as I pointed out, there are 4 organizations involved, and I know that I apologize if there are other people I should have mentioned by names, but you're just the people I know. But David, so with a thanks to you, I'm now going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Bernard. And thank you for chairing that. Thanks to everybody who took part, not only in that part of the discussion, but earlier today and indeed yesterday, because without the brilliant contributions we've had, it wouldn't have been the amazing meeting that I think it has been. And one of the impressions I get is that we are beginning to create a kind of coherent field using the attention and intention and the modulation of consciousness that's been talked about today. I just want to share my screen to give you an image of this, because what I was trying to do earlier on was find something, and I thought about Indra's net, and this is an incredibly beautiful image here with the center, but all the connections and circles going out and everything connected with everything else, which is one of the things we've been talking about, and that's love, as we said, and the light which connects all these things together. And then here's another one, so you can sort of take your pick as to which one you like most, but it's the world enveloped in an Indra's net of light, and each of us is at a different place on this grid, as it were, but the center is everywhere, and we are the center, and the center is in us, and we are in that center. And so I just leave you those 2 images of our process. And I think one of the things that my reflection on this is how we go forward in relating the first and the third person, what we call the inner and the outer. And I think that the deeper and more subtle understanding that we're arriving at is that we can't make this hard and fast distinction between the subjective and objective, the inner and the outer. And we need to be able to map this somehow in a convincing way. And I was going to say that one of the projects that we've got for the phase 3 of the Galileo Commission is mapping these synchronistic experiences of people who are involved in the commission, and working with Gary and others on this, because I think that's the interface between information and meaning, because information are just out there without being perceived, doesn't have any relevance to us. And this is something that David Bohm was also very keen on, the translation of information into meaning. And I now see that the task of the Galileo Commission is not just widening the evidence base for a science of consciousness, which is the phrase I've been using recently, post-materialist science, evidence-based spirituality, but it's also widening and deepening the theoretical base, as we've heard from Ed today, because we need new theoretical approaches as well as new experimental approaches and experiential coordination, if you like, bringing experiment and experience together. So I'd like to thank everybody for being here, because without everybody who's attended in the last couple of days, we wouldn't have had a meeting. We'd have been in cyberspace, but on our own. So I see that in the chat there's quite a lot of messages of people feeling they found their tribe, and so I do encourage you to join us, join the Galileo Commission, join the Scientific and Medical Network, spread the word, because we are a gathering of people who are at this kind of what they call a cutting edge or frontier. And we need to be talking about these matters, these experiences, these experiments, these theories, to our peers and those in our circle. So do spread the word and spread it around your own networks. Because if we each spread something around our own network, it goes a long way, and we reach other kind of centers, if you like. Just finally, I want to mention the upcoming events, which you'll find in the chat links, the links that Andrew has put in. Our next event is Professor Elaine Howard Eklund on Wednesday for secularity and science, and then Keith Ward the following week on religion and spirituality in the modern world, and then Unlimited Love with Stephen Post on 30th of December. And these are very friendly times for US-based attenders, because they're always in the evening, so it's the morning for you, so we can sort of reach across the pond. And my final thing I want to say is a story. And last year I was at the SAND meeting in Italy, which regrettably didn't take place this year. And I met Shakti Katerina Maggi, who was giving a presentation as well. And I had a brief cup of tea with her, and she gave me, I don't know whether you can see this, she gave me this, and it's a bent spoon, bent in a way that is impossible to do, even if you try to do it and just produce the spoon like this. And she said to me, everything is possible. And so that's the message I'd like to leave you with this evening. And I'm going to do this, I'm going to send this out, this impulse, with the candle here. I've had the candle lit during this session. So this all represents the light that we've generated, and the sense of coherence and, dare I say, love, that is the organizing field. So I very much look forward to seeing you at future events and as part of our community. And thank you so much for being here. So that concludes, I think, our online Galileo Commission Summit. And I think Andrew is going to, our usual thing, we unmute and greet each other and say goodbye and au revoir, as the French say, to the next time. So,
feel free to unmute yourselves, everyone, now. Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Goodbye. Till next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Bernard, for what you did to monitor this.
Oh, thank you, Seba.